Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we are having a look at a fascinating piece of adaptive writing technology. This is a Perkins Brailler, first introduced in 1951, and as the name implies, this is designed to type documents in Braille, the tactile writing system designed for the visually impaired. Now, the history of Braille... I'm just messing with you. The video actually starts now. Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we're having a look at a fascinating piece of adaptive writing technology. This is a Perkins Brailler, first introduced in 1951, and as the name implies, this is designed to type documents in Braille, the tactile writing system for the visually impaired. Now, the history of Braille and other tactile alphabets is a fascinating one, and the development of a mechanical means of writing Braille is an often overlooked branch of typewriter history. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, the Braille alphabet is named after its inventor, Louis Braille, who was born in 1809 just outside Paris. Braille's father was a leather worker, and from an early age, young Louis spent a lot of time playing in the family workshop. One day, at the age of 3, he was attempting to punch holes in a piece of leather with an awl when the tool slipped and stabbed him in the eye. The eye soon developed a severe infection, which quickly spread to the other eye, and within weeks he was completely blind. Nonetheless, his parents attempted to provide for him as normal a childhood as possible, and he eventually learned to navigate his hometown and attend school unassisted. And his diligence and persistence earned him a place at one of the first dedicated schools for the visually impaired in the world, the Royal Institution for Blind Youth in Paris. Now, the founder of the Royal Institute, Valentin Haüy, also developed one of the first tactile alphabets for the visually impaired, comprising large traditional Latin letters embossed onto the page using a set of sculpted wire molds. Now, while the system was a significant step forward in the education of the visually impaired, it did suffer from a number of serious drawbacks. For example, the letters had to be large enough to be easily discernible by touch, meaning that books printed in this manner were necessarily short and very simplified. Also, the embossing process was slow and cumbersome and couldn't be replicated by the students themselves, meaning they couldn't compose their own texts. And as an aside, there are visually impaired people who can read ordinary newsprint by touch because certain forms of the offset printing process create slightly raised letters that can be discerned with enough practice, which I think is pretty cool. Now, Louis Braille in particular was frustrated by his inability to write letters home to his family from school, so his father crafted for him a set of leather letters that he could trace to compose text. And while this system was very slow and cumbersome, it worked. But Braille was convinced that there had to be a better system that was faster to write and easier to read. Then, in 1821, he was introduced to a system called night writing, or the manual alphabet, invented by one Charles Barbier in 1815. Now, you'll often read that Barbier was a former artillery officer who designed his system to allow soldiers to communicate at night on the battlefield, that he met a young Louis Braille at the Royal Institute, and that the two butted heads over the relative merits of their respective alphabets. But unfortunately, all of this was invented by later biographers. Barbier only spent a very brief time in the military. He always intended his system to be used by the visually impaired, and he didn't meet Louis Braille until 1833, a couple of years after Braille had published his own system. And even the term night writing for Barbier's alphabet was invented by another journalist. But, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? Anyway, like modern Braille, the Barbier system was based on a series of raised dots embossed onto the page, which could easily be read using the fingertips. Now, Barbier actually developed two different versions of this system. In the first, 25 letters of the Latin alphabet were arranged in a 5x5 grid, such that each could be identified by a unique 2-number code. For example, A was 1-1, H was 2-3, S 4-4, and so on. These codes were then translated into a pattern of dots arranged in 2 vertical columns of 5. So A would be left to right, 1 and 1 dot, H 2 and 3 dots, S 4 and 4 dots, and so on. And if you're wondering what happened to the 26th letter, W wasn't part of the official French alphabet at the time, and even today is very rarely used in that language. Barbier also devised a phonetic version of this system with 36 basic sounds in the French language arranged in a 6x6 grid. This was translated into embossed symbols in the same manner as before, only using 2 columns of 6 instead of 5. Now, Barbier himself preferred this latter system because he felt that the complex rules of French spelling put less educated children at a disadvantage, and as a French speaker who absolutely sucks at written French orthography, fair enough. Now, Charles Barbier contacted the Royal Institution for Blind Youth and attempted to sell them on his system, but the then director had heavily invested in Valentin Haüy's raised lettering system and turned him down. However, in 1821, that director was replaced by a new one who was a lot more receptive and asked some of his students to try out Barbier's system. And it was incredibly successful and was soon adopted by the school as standard. Now, while far more effective than older systems, Barbier night writing still had its drawbacks. Not only was it fairly bulky, but it also had no capacity for writing punctuation, upper and lowercase letters, musical notes, and other special characters. Nonetheless, it was a huge step forward and inspired Louis Braille to develop his own, more compact and flexible system, the first version of which he published in 1829. Now, Braille's first version of his alphabet used both dots and dashes, rather like Morse code, but he soon realized that these were very difficult to tell apart, so in his revised 1837 edition, he got rid of the dashes entirely and just used dots. Like Barbier's system, Braille is based on 2 columns of raised dots, though with 3 rather than 6 dots per column. This, significantly, allows the entire cell to be felt and read with a single finger touch. Now, the system is divided into decades or sets of 10 symbols, with common elements repeating between each decade. The first decade establishes the basic pattern, a single dot, a column of 2, a row of 2, and so on, and represents the letters A through J and the numerals 1 to 0. The second decade, representing the letters K through T, repeats this pattern but adds a single dot at position 3, i.e. the lower left-hand corner, while the third decade, representing the letters U to Z, adds a dot in position 6, the lower right-hand corner. Now, in the original French Braille alphabet, the third decade also included the accented letters C, C, Z, E accent aigu, A accent grave, E accent grave, U accent grave, while the fourth decade contained A, E, I, O, U, accent circonflexe, E, I, O, tréma, the ligature OE, and finally W, added later to accommodate the English language. The characters in the fourth decade are distinguished by a single dot in position 6. English, of course, does not use these accents except in certain loan words, so in the standard English Braille alphabet, the third decade is filled out by the words and, for, of, the, and with, and the fourth by the ligature CH, GH, SH, TH, WH, ED, ER, OU, and OW, followed by, as before, W. Now, since Louis Braille's time, numerous refinements and expansions have been made to this basic system. As there are 64 different combinations for a basic Braille cell, even the 4 decades I've previously mentioned allow for 24 additional characters, including a blank space. Braille alphabets have also been developed for 133 languages, music notation, and in many systems, including English, there are abbreviated forms as well as even shorter stenographic forms for greater efficiency. And to learn more about the fascinating history of stenography, please check out my previous video on stenographs, link in the description. Now, before we move on, it's worth noting that a raised lettering system was developed and widely used well after the development of Braille. This was Moon type, developed in 1843 by British inventor William Moon, who had lost his sight to scarlet fever at the age of 21. Moon type was a simplified embossed version of the Latin alphabet designed to be more easily readable by touch. Now, while in the end Braille proved more flexible and versatile and was more widely adopted, Moon type nonetheless filled an important niche for people who had lost their sight later in life and were thus more familiar with regular Latin characters. Now, despite its many advantages, one of the major disadvantages of Braille was that it was very slow and cumbersome to write. To streamline the writing of his manual alphabet, Charles Barbier had developed a special slate which allowed the user to neatly emboss the letter cells using a blunt stylus. This tablet and stylus system was subsequently adapted by Louis Braille for his own alphabet and remained the standard method for writing Braille for many decades. But the laboriousness of this method caused Braille to fall more and more out of favor, such that by the end of the 19th century, it was barely being taught at all, at least in North American schools. However, in 1892, American inventor Frank H. Hall, then superintendent of the Illinois Institution for the Blind in Jacksonville, Illinois, unveiled the Hall Braille Writer. Designed like a typical typewriter, his machine features 7 keys, one for each of the 6 positions in the Braille letter cell and 1 space key. Similar to on a stenograph, this was a corded keyboard, meaning all 6 keys could be pressed at once in various combinations to type all 64 possible Braille characters. Pressing the keys extended a set of blunt pins, which pressed the paper against a platen mounted on an arm hanging over the machine, embossing the dots. Significantly, the system embossed the characters right side up and left to right, allowing the user to read the text by touch as they typed it. Previously, the tablet and stylus system required the user to write upside down and right to left. Using the Hall Braille Writer, a trained operator could achieve typing speeds of up to 50 words per minute. Hall worked with local gunsmith Gustav Sieber to build the first prototype, which he presented to the Munson Typewriter Company of Chicago. After the company produced 6 pilot models, 2 high-level employees, T.B. Harrison and Samuel J. Seafried, quit to form their own company company and manufacture Hall's design. Harrison and Seafried would go on to manufacture Hall Braille writers for decades, selling each unit for only $11 or around $440 in today's money. Heartwarmingly, Frank Hall refused to patent his design, believing it would be immoral to profit from his invention. And in the 1930s, the American Foundation for the Blind officially acquired the manufacturing and distribution rights to the Hall Braille writer. Now, in addition to helping bring Braille back from the brink of extinction and make it the standard for tactile alphabets, the Hall Braille writer also put the last nail in the coffin for the competing 8-dot New York point system and the Kaleidograph typewriter, both developed by American inventor William Bell Waite in 1868. Of course, a number of alternative Braille machines were developed over the following decades, including the Stainsby Brailler, invented by Henry Stainsby in 1903. This was a more lightweight machine that used a moving carriage with 6 keys and embossing pins that moved over a stationary platen, rather similar to the early simplex low-cost typewriters I've covered in previous videos, links in the description. However, it was not until the 1950s that a true successor to the Hall Brailler finally emerged. In the late 1930s, Gabriel Farrell, director of the Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, became frustrated with existing Braille machines like the Hall, which were heavy, noisy, and being hand-assembled, were often difficult to repair and suffered from loose tolerances. He thus instructed 2 of his teachers, David Abraham and Edward Waterhouse, to develop a superior design. The result was the Perkins Brailler, which we have here. Unfortunately, the outbreak of the Second World War delayed the production of this design, which did not become readily available until 1951. Right, so after all of that preamble, let's finally have a look at this Perkins Brailler and let me show you how it works. Okay, so this was very clearly designed in the 1950s, what with this very retro faux hammered metal finish. On the front, we have a cast nameplate reading Perkins Brailler, and below that, a data plate indicating that this was invented by David Abraham and distributed by the Haüy Memorial Press and the Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts. And finally, on the bottom, we have a serial number, M2064. Now, at first, Perkins Braillers used a 4-digit serial number, but after machine 9999, a lighter prefix was added, starting with A and incrementing every 10,000 units. Now, I wasn't able to pin down an exact date, but best as I can determine, this was probably manufactured sometime in the mid-1970s. But as always, if any of you have more precise information than that, please let me know and I'll add it in the description of this video. Now, the keyboard has 9 keys from left to right, the line space key, equivalent to return on a conventional keyboard, the dot keys for positions 1, 2, and 3, the forward space key, the dot keys for positions 4, 5, and 6, and the backspace key. Above this, we have a carriage lever, which allows you to unlock and move the carriage forward and backward, a fold and carry handle, and a pair of paper release levers. And finally, on the sides, we have a pair of paper advance knobs, and on the back, a pair of sliders for setting the left and right margins. This component here is the embossing head, which actually presses the Braille dots onto the paper. Right, so to use this, you twist the paper advance knobs away from you until they stop, then pull the paper release levers all the way back. You then insert your paper under this feed roller and push it as far back in and as far left as it will go, ensuring that it sits under the embossing head. And you'll notice that this feed roller is grooved or ribbed. This is designed so that the ribs fit between and do not flatten the embossed Braille dots. You then push the paper release levers forward to lock the page in place. Next, you twist the paper advance knob until they stop, which should occur when the top of the page sits just under the embossing head. And finally, you press the line spacer key to lock the line mechanism. Now, when you turn the paper advance knobs, they will increment line by line rather than turning freely. Now you are ready to type, and as you can see, every time you press the keys, the corresponding dots are embossed onto the page, and the carriage advances 1 space. And as with a regular typewriter, you can skip forward a space by pressing the forward space key, or back a space by pressing the backspace key. And by the way, mistakes are typically erased by burnishing down the dots using a special stylus called a Braille eraser, or more commonly overwriting the mistake by pressing all 6 keys at once. Once the carriage reaches the end of travel, a bell will sound like on a regular typewriter. You then draw the carriage back all the way to the left and either press the line spacing key or twist the paper advance knobs 1 full stop to raise the paper to the next line. And that's really all there is to it. Right, so let's actually open this up and see how the internal mechanism works. We undo these screws on the top cover and unthread the knobs on the paper release levers, which allows us to lift off the cover. And then we remove the bottom and then the rear covers to reveal the rest of the mechanism. Now, on the inside of the rear cover, we can see the ratchet mechanism for margin adjustment, as well as the end of carriage travel bell. Right, so here you can see the internal drum around which the paper wraps, as well as the carriage, which rides on this linear shaft and is connected to this copper-colored chain, itself wrapped around a pair of spring-loaded sprockets that apply constant tension to the right. On the bottom of the carriage is a spring-loaded pull which engages in this linear ratchet. When we press any of the dot keys or the forward space key, the whole ratchet tilts back, allowing the carriage to advance one space before the pull re-engages. However, if we press the backspace key, this engages a ratchet in one of the chain pulleys, driving it and the carriage back one space. Pressing the line space key engages a ratchet on the paper feed drum, moving it up one space, while pressing the carriage lever tilts the pull away from the ratchet rather than the other way around, allowing the carriage to move freely. Finally, as the carriage reaches the end of its travel, we can see how this roller lifts up and releases this hinged clapper, ringing the bell. And when we draw the carriage back, the roller rides over top of the clapper and falls down on the other side, resetting itself for the next line. Now at last we come to the heart of the system, the embossing head, which is a really odd little mechanism. The top section of the head has a small platen with 6 small indentations matching the standard 2x3 Braille grid, while the bottom section has a matching pattern of blunt extendable embossing pins. Now if we remove this access panel, we can see that these pins are bent so that they go from a rectangular pattern at the top to a linear pattern at the bottom, with the bottom of each pin resting against one of these long rectangular bars. Now when we push any of the dot keys, it tilts the corresponding bar, which pushes up the appropriate embossing pin. Simultaneously, this action clamps down the platen against the pins, embossing the desired dot pattern into the paper. Not the most intuitive way of solving this problem, but it must work since hundreds of thousands of Perkins Braillers are still in use in over 170 countries all around the world. Now, since this time, more sophisticated Braille writing and reading technologies have been developed, including electric dot matrix style embossers, both standalone or peripheral units that can be plugged into personal computers, and refreshable displays that use electromechanical pop-up pins or piezoelectric crystals to dynamically display Braille text. And while today speech-to-text and other technologies are becoming increasingly popular, nearly 200 years after its invention, Braille continues to be a vital tool to allow the visually impaired to write and communicate. As Louis Braille himself said, access to information in the widest sense is access to knowledge, and that is vitally important to us if we, the blind, are not to go on being despised or patronized by condescending sighted people. We do not need pity, nor do we need to be reminded we are vulnerable. We must be treated as equals, and communication is the way this can be brought about. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly had a great time delving into the finer details of the Braille system, which previously I'd only been tangentially familiar with. I'll see you next time in another video or look at yet more typewriters and other fascinating devices just like this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day. And if you're wondering what happened to the 26th letter, W wasn't part of the official French alphabet at the time, and even today is very rarely used in that language.